continue our ACC tour and go with North Carolina now. We talked about Virginia Tech. We talked about Stanford. We talked about Louisville, Clemson, Duke, you name it. And I got to circle back on North Carolina because they are getting a lot of hype this year. Obviously, the Bill Belichick story, the drama with his girlfriend. I'm not getting into that on the show. I'm focused strictly on how they're going to do as a football program. Obviously, they're invested some serious dough into Bill Belichick. They're going to pay him $50 million over the course of 5 seasons. They spent $12.5 million on his staff alone. And, there has been a lot of turnover for this program for the most part. I mean, they've done a solid job at keeping some of the recruits that Mac Brown was able to bring in and everything. They do have Freddie Kitchens, who's in his 3rd season at North Carolina, and he's primarily going to be the offensive play caller for them. So I think that ultimately is a positive that they're keeping up with that continuality of that element of the football. But at the same time, to me, there are still some serious question marks with North Carolina. Now, granted, they do deserve a lot of credit for this. I will say, before a couple weeks ago, my biggest thing was who the heck's going to be their quarterback? I would not feel very confident going into the year with Max Johnson, just given his injury history. And quite frankly, I think he already kind of hit his peak in the sense of, okay, you're going to rely on a graduate transfer who's coming off multiple injuries. Now, granted, when he was at Texas A&M and when he's healthy, he certainly is a starting quarterback, and I don't want to take anything away from him. But when you have that kind of uncertainty, it definitely would give me a little bit of hesitation, which leads me into Gio Lopez, who I think all things considered is probably the best guy that they could have went after. Now, obviously, there were certain conversations about maybe them going after Nico, but I think Gio is a little bit more of a safer option. He's a kid from South Alabama, Major Applewhite, head coach over there, has done a phenomenal job at really developing this kid. And South Alabama in particular, they kind of have an air raid offense over there, very pass heavy, very explosive. And I think somebody who's going to be an immediate asset for this program. I mean, he's 6 foot, 220, definitely has an underrated amount of speed. He's a redshirt freshman too, so he's certainly a young guy, and they can develop around him, bring in some more talent too. And the Jaguars were overall 7-6 last season, so they were at a point too where they are relatively new to the FBS too. So it's definitely a big positive to see, hey, if Gio Lopez can do it at the Sun Belt level, we can see how much of this can translate to the ACC, especially given that, their backup options at quarterback were Bryce Baker, who's an incoming freshman, and I think he's going to be a highly touted guy for maybe years to come or something like that. But he's a very good insurance policy right now, and we're at the point where it probably is for the best, where he can sit behind Lopez for a year or two and perhaps be the starter at a later time. And then we move forward and we talk about Ryan Brown, who originally was going to be competing for the starting job, but then once when he realized that he doesn't have any shot at getting the starting job, he went back to Purdue, and he's going to be over with Barry Odom over there. So all things considered, we know Gio Lopez is the starting guy, and I think it also gives us a idea of what North Carolina is really going to do offensively too. Because I think that's, for me, the biggest question mark about North Carolina offensively is how is their offense going to evolve, right? Because for those of you who didn't watch much North Carolina last year, they had a quarterback carousel of quarterbacks. I mean, you go back and, I briefly mentioned Max Johnson, and he tore his ACL week 1 versus Minnesota. And that was just such a devastating injury for him too, because, I love Mac Brown. I think he's a phenomenal coach. And at least for me, that really felt like a season where I could sit there and say that North Carolina could have been a real threat and could have been a little bit of a challenge, but it just didn't quite turn out that way. And especially too, at least defensively, they had a number of games where they simply collapsed defensively. I mean, I'm sure a lot of North Carolina fans are relieved that Jeff Collins is no longer their defense coordinator, and they bring in Stephen Belichick too, who has some sniffing experience over with the Washington Huskies. So I think that transition is going to be a big positive too. And granted, they were able to keep some of the talent from the original North Carolina defense of last year, which is a start. I mean, they're definitely going to be a younger group, And it also is a big positive, particularly on the recruiting front, that they focus primarily on the front seven, which I was, quite frankly, a little bit surprised because I know for me, yes, they got bullied a little bit in the trenches, and I think a lot of teams were kind of running all over them too. But I think you got to sit there and say it would have been a big help if they at least cover the secondary a little bit, which for me is definitely going to be a big question mark too. I mean, you see below they have 18 incoming additions, which is really a solid start, all things considered too. And North Carolina is going to be one of those teams where I just think there's going to be such a wild card. And granted, there is a lot of positive going for 'em. I mean, you could see in the ticker below, Jim Phillips is all over North Carolina, primarily just because of the eyes that Bill Belichick's going to bring to the product. I mean, that story kind of sells itself too. And granted, everybody's going to talk about, oh, can Bill Belichick coach at a college level? Can he bring in the right players? Can he bring in the right support? And from what we can all see outside of Chapel Hill, they have the support surrounding him clearly. So there's no shortage of cash. There's no shortage of support. I mean, even Bubba Cunningham, he's going all in. He said even during spring ball, even a couple months ago, like, hey, we're all in on this project. I've spoke with him directly. I was along the recruiting front. Their roster tickets over 25%, just to be able to accommodate these changes too. So overall, there's going to be a lot riding on this too, and especially in this day and age of college football, somehow every coach only gets 2 or 3 seasons now to legitimately make a turnaround, or I guess you can call it a turnaround. I mean, granted, for the most part, North Carolina has been in a bowl game. I think for the past like 6 seasons, they've been pretty consistent in that front. But I think the issue with Mack Brown was, I think everybody loves him as a person, as a head coach, as a recruiter. I'm all for that too. But I think where the disconnect is between what Mack Brown could have done was just the fact that he had so many talented quarterbacks, yet somehow it always seemed like they underachieved with him as a head coach. I mean, you go back and, I think of Mitchell Trubisky. I go back and think of Drake May, for example. All these different quarterbacks that he's had that have gone on to be NFL prospects, and now the Sun, I mean, they're peaking at 6, 7, 8 wins. And if you're Bubba Cunningham, I mean, you got to sit there and say to yourself, hey, this isn't really the direction that we want to go in Chapel Hill too, especially when you have an ACC that's more open than ever now. I mean, granted, you go back, and I talked about Florida State a little bit before. They're getting to a point where I think they are heading in the right direction. You can follow my video on that too. I mean, Clemson's obviously the big dog, right? They're the number 1 team, I would say, by a long shot. However, North Carolina is at least in a position where they can make some real progress in terms of etching themselves closer to being that sort of top tier of ACC college football. They clearly spent $20 million plus. You have to imagine that they're going to do some renovations on the stadium and all that stuff too. I'm pretty sure that's in the works. I don't have a direct report that's confirming that as well. But at least for me, the big question mark is going to be more so defensively, particularly in the secondary. How quickly can Stephen Belichick turn the team around defensively? Yes, there isn't as much turnover as there necessarily is on paper. I mean, at least in terms of the staff there is. Now, granted, yes, they kept Freddie Kitchens, and I think that's going to be somewhat of a help because, when I talked about Gio Lopez, he finished 4th in the Sun Belt in passing, 2,559 yards, 4th in touchdown passes with 18, 66% completion percentage. So he is totally a viable starter for him, and I think is somebody who's going to be pretty electric for him too. And also, quite frankly, somebody who could be a weapon for him in terms of the running game. They did bring in Benjamin Hall from Michigan, who quite frankly was underutilized for the Wolverines, and I think could be another spark for them as they navigate this new ACC in this first year with Bill Belichick. I mean, all the eyes are going to be on him. They have 7 nationally televised games this year. which is remarkably more than what they were doing before. And as I've mentioned before in this show, the ACC is moving to a revenue-based model in terms of how the distributions of the fundings turn out. So as you can see, that obviously plays another big role in terms of why they brought Bill Belichick in too. But overall, there's some exciting things going on with them. I think another big part of the hype with them too is just overall how generous their schedule is. Let's just point it out there. I mean, I think they got pretty fortunate in terms of year one for a Bill Belichick schedule. I think TCU is always going to be a tough matchup no matter what, but they're still kind of figuring out their way. So I think that's really going to be a game that's going to have a lot of eyes on people, something that's going to be talked about in really a bunch of college football circles. You go down the line here, and they play a couple more cupcake games versus Charlotte on the road. Then you play Richmond, and then you travel down to UCF and play Scott Frost, who's in his first season. But what's really odd about North Carolina's schedule is where the bye weeks are. Because after you go down to Central Florida, you have a bye the 27th, then you go play Clemson, and then you have another bye. So that to me is definitely a serious miss in general because, well, number one, it's very early in the season to have two straight bye weeks. But at the same time, I would not feel very happy about having to play 7 straight conference games back to back to back to back. I mean, first off, you have to travel to UCal, which obviously should be a win. Then you go to Virginia. I mean, when you sit there and look at your schedule and you know that your 3 hardest games are Clemson, Syracuse, and Duke, I would feel pretty freaking confident. And I would also sit there and say that if you don't find a way to win at least 8 games this year, there's going to be some serious question marks in terms of, is Bill Belichick achieving enough? Because if I were a North Carolina fan, I would first off be relieved that they got a very generous schedule. You don't have to play Miami. You don't have to play Louisville. You don't have to play Boston College. You don't have to play Georgia Tech. You're avoiding pretty much all of the teams that I think would be a legitimate tough opponent for them. Now, granted, Duke obviously is legit, and that's obviously a pretty historical rivalry right there. But you sit there and say to yourself too, it seems like North Carolina is going to be a team that we're going to be talking about for a while, especially just given the national spotlight on them. But here's what they got going for them in short. They have a very generous schedule that at a minimum should get a bowl game no matter what. I'm thinking close to 8. The betting line to 7.5. I'm going to sit there and say that for me, a 8-4 should really be the figure that I would be at if I were a Tar Heel fan. And then you bring in Gio Lopez, who's one of the bright spots in all of the G5. He's going to be a media contributor. You have Freddie Kitchens coming back for his 3rd season at North Carolina, so there's a little bit of continuity there. And then obviously Stephen Belichick running the defense, seeing if he can clean up that secondary, bring in a lot more pieces onto the defensive front, and hopefully be at a situation where they can kind of put it all together defensively. They play a little bit more consistent, particularly in those closer games, those one-score games that they blew a bunch last season, and see if they can finally get a lot more sustainable attention on this program